Our spoken call to worship this morning comes from my colleague, Carolyn Owen-Toll. Come into this house of worship. Come in, bringing all of who you are. Rest and quiet your weak, worn spirit. For you are here to touch again the eternal springs of hope and renewal. Calm your hurried pace. Thank you. For this hour, let the cares, the fretfulness, and worry be set aside. Forgive yourself. You are so very worthy of moving on, of making new efforts, of trying again. Know that you are not alone. There is strength and caring support for you here. You will find comfort if you but ask. Look around. You are part of an amazing community. You can make it what you will. Come, let us worship together this morning. Find ourselves today in the middle of the Jewish high holidays. Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, began at sundown on September 13th, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, begins at sundown on September 22nd. In the Jewish tradition, this time is about joy and forgiveness, about taking stock of where you are in your various relationships, about resolving to change in the new year ahead. There is rejoicing and freedom in the new year of Rosh Hashanah, which moves into Yom Kippur and the process of reflection, forgiveness, and atonement. The high holidays are not about feeling guilty, but rather about an openness to the process of change, a healthy spiritual discipline, whether we identify as Jewish or not. Taking account and realizing that if we don't make changes internally and in our communities and in our society, all of the guilt and self-criticism are just an empty ritual and waste of time and energy. This tradition teaches us that the focus on the high holiday season is not a focus on what others did to us, but on what we ourselves did to lessen the connection to our highest possible selves and to the interdependent web of existence. This tradition teaches us about forgiveness of ourselves and others and urges us to a recommitment to begin again in love. Now, I don't want people to raise their hands on this one, but how many people here today feel that at some point in their life they have been wronged? And how many of us know that we have wronged others? All of us. So the question then becomes, what do we do with this knowledge, with this imperfect humanity? One possibility is for us to wallow in our resentments and our anger, remaining stuck, thinking that somehow holding on to the situation and the hurt and the anger, that somehow that will hurt the other person or the other situation. But resentment only hurts us. And it causes us to live the violation over and over again. In effect, we lose our creative freedom to act and be in new ways. No chance for release, but only imprisonment in pain and victimhood. Repeating the past hurts over and over. This is what the philosopher Hannah Arendt says when she writes, "Without being forgiven, released from the consequences of what we have done, our capacity to act would, as it were, be confined to a single deed from which we could never recover. We would remain victims of its consequences forever, not unlike the sorcerer's apprentice who lacked that magic spell to break the formula, to break the spell. We are trapped and cannot be free. But the good news is that there's another possibility. There is a path to freedom. All of the major faiths in the world teach us that forgiveness is this path to freedom. A verse from the Bhagavad Gita, one of the most important sacred scriptures of Hinduism, states, "If you want to see the brave, look for those who can forgive. If you want to see the heroic, look for those who can love in return for hatred." Islam teaches that Allah is the most forgiving and the original source of all forgiveness. In place of anger, sorrow, and the desire for revenge in response to harm, Buddhism emphasizes loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. Christianity speaks of repentance, admission of sin, and reparation. And in Judaism, the days leading up to Yom Kippur are a time of seeking forgiveness from those you have harmed. Choosing this path to freedom through forgiveness is about deciding who or what is going to have power in your life. When we forgive, we are freed, not necessarily from the hurt itself, but from the dominating power of that hurt. We're able to give up our anger. It's about not giving the offending person or situation the power to live in your head and your heart and poison you. It's about not holding on to the resentment that in reality is only hurting yourself. Forgiveness is about letting go, freeing up, putting to better use the energy that is consumed when we hold grudges and harbor resentments and nurse those unhealed wounds that we all carry around. It is rediscovering the strengths that we always had. You see, forgiveness comes first for our own sake. It is the action of someone with tremendous spiritual strength, the action of someone who refuses to be consumed by hatred and revenge. But boy, I think we can all attest that that is so much easier said than done sometimes, many times. But this is important work. This is soul work. This is the work of our whole lifetime. As the quote by Martin Luther King Jr. on the front or inside of the Orders of Service Today says, "Forgiveness is not an occasional act. It is a permanent attitude." It's the work of our whole life because our very freedom is at stake. We must learn to begin again and again and again and again in love. Perhaps we resist forgiveness because of what we think it entails. So let's first talk about what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness does not mean condoning by failing to see or judge the action as wrong. And this is key. We do not have to let go of the knowledge that the act was wrong, nor is the act of forgiveness saying that we are okay with what happened. Remember, forgiveness is about letting go to free yourself. Forgiveness is not about being nice. When we forgive, we can still hold the offender responsible. Forgiveness is not about excusing or enabling people to shirk responsibility for their own actions. But if we Unitarian Universalists truly live our first principle and affirm every person's inherent worth and dignity, then we know also that each person bears responsibility for their actions. If we erase responsibility for what they did, then we erase a key part of their humanity. Affirming a person's inherent worth and dignity requires that we remind them and empower them to own their own actions and accept the consequences. And forgiveness is not necessarily about reconciliation. Forgiveness is something that we do to free ourselves, but reconciliation is when all parties in a conflict are willing to sit down at the same table with love and compassion and an openness to listen and change. Of course, we can hope that we can have both forgiveness and reconciliation, but often this is not the case. The person that you hurt might not, or the person that hurt you might not ever want to change or even be capable of change. Or they might be out of our lives permanently for one reason or another. And finally, when we forgive, we don't forget that we were hurt, that we may still be hurting now, and that we may hurt for a very long time, perhaps even our whole life. Forgiveness is not denial and forgetting. It's a change of heart without erasing or forgetting the facts of the past. So we forgive and remember, free ourselves, and go forward. Forgiveness then transforms our relationship with what has hurt us without any forgetting, without any diminishment of our sense of right and wrong, without any demand that we put ourselves back in harm's way by diminishing another's responsibility for their actions, and without any necessary change in the other person or situation. Forgiveness is a matter of how we reframe our relationship with the past so we are no longer trapped by it and living it over and over again. It's about taking back the power in your life. But here's the hard part about forgiveness. We all know you're supposed to forgive, and we may really, deep down in our heart, want to forgive, but we just can't will ourselves into some magical state of forgiveness. You know what I'm talking about? That's why I referred to forgiveness earlier as a spiritual practice, a spiritual discipline. Forgiveness isn't something that we give or do, not something that can be forced, but it's rather something that is received. Not a one-time action, it's this process and attitude that has to unfold authentically. It's a gift. And the gift comes from understanding ourselves as part of a common humanity, a belief that we can all, each of us, grow and change and evolve, a desire for unity and peace. It comes from a deep knowledge of ourselves as beautiful but imperfect human beings. I've heard that some Japanese kimonos, the robes that are worn, are very plain on the outside, and some even have imperfections sewn purposefully into them on the outside. But on the inside, they're intricately, there it is, beautiful and meticulously crafted. Perhaps the purpose of this is to remind the wearer, beauty lies within. Those who see the robe being worn with only the imperfect visible outside are reminded to think of the magnificence beneath the exterior of the robe of the person and of themselves. Looking to what is inside of the kimono, beyond the imperfection, is precisely what forgiveness is. When you're able to look beyond the mistakes and imperfections of people and recognize their humanity, you will begin on the path to forgiveness. I want to say a quick word about the limits of forgiveness. Like many of you, I imagine, I wonder about the boundaries beyond which forgiveness is impossible. Are there boundaries? In Unitarian Universalism, with love as the doctrine of our faith, our approach to forgiveness must be informed by this question: what does love require? To forgive means to stand on the side of love. But I personally feel that there are times when this is not possible because the injury is so heinous that it simply cannot be forgiven. So yes, I would argue that there are limits to forgiveness. Simon Wiesenthal recalls his demoralizing life in a concentration camp and his envy of the dead Germans who had sunflowers marking their graves. At the time, he assumed that his grave would be a mass one, unmarked and forgotten. One day, Wiesenthal was taken to a hospital at the request of Karl, a dying SS man, tormented by his crimes, including the murder of a Jewish family with a small child that he committed by burning down the house in which they were locked. He wanted to confess and to be forgiven by a Jew. Karl told Wiesenthal all he had done, and he asked for forgiveness. Wiesenthal responded by silently walking out of the room. Judaism teaches that one can only forgive someone that has harmed them. This is why in Jewish tradition, murder is the one act that is unforgivable. Not to say that that's where all of us would come down on the issue, but an example. We all might have different definitions about the limits of forgiveness. But as much as we humanly can, we need to strive toward the spiritual practice of forgiveness, both for our own sake and for the sake of this very imperfect world. Author Kent Nerburn writes, "Forgiveness cannot be a disengaged pastel emotion. It is demanded in the bloodiest of human circumstances, and it must stand against the strong winds of human rage and hate. To be a real virtue, engaged with the world around us, it must be muscular and alive and able to withstand the outrages and inequities of inhuman and inhumane acts. It must be able to face that shadow side of the human condition." And how we shape such forgiveness is one of the most crucial questions in our lives, and it is not easy. Sometimes we get so frustrated that we think we can't take it anymore, but we can, and we must. It is our human responsibility and part of our spiritual work to be done as Unitarian Universalists. Even though we know that forgiveness, if misused or misunderstood, can become a tacit partner in the wrongs around us, we also know that when properly applied, it is the glue that holds this human family together. And it is our commitment to live in the interconnected web of all being. So with forgiveness, we heal what is broken in ourselves. So how do we move toward this forgiveness, this elusive thing? The first step is knowing that in some way, all forgiveness is really self-forgiveness. We are all flawed, imperfect, and human. And we must know the sincere power held in the words, "I'm sorry," and the sweet balm of the response, "I forgive you." Sometimes this world is hard, and we need to be so gentle with ourselves and with each other. Forgive yourself, forgive others, apologize, make amends, be free. And here's the second step, and this, I have to admit, was very hard-won knowledge for me. Don't aim directly at forgiveness as your goal. It's slippery and lofty and at times seemingly impossible to attain. Don't aim directly at forgiveness as a goal. Aim instead for mercy and compassion and love. Choose as a spiritual practice extending this loving kindness and compassion to all, to yourself and to others. Choose as a spiritual practice extending loving kindness and compassion and love even to those who are difficult in your life, who have wronged you, who have hurt you. Breathe compassion and love into this world in which people can be so cruel in their anger and self-righteousness and pettiness, and know that sometimes beneath all of that is a hopelessness. Sometimes beneath all that might be a sense of devastating worthlessness or pain. Breathe compassion into this. Realize that they are merely human like us, and we are merely human like them. Forgive them for being human and hope they do the same for you. Circle back to our first Unitarian Universalist principle that each person has worth as a human being. Hate does not erase wrongs, but rather eats away at our very humanity. Instead, offer your compassion and love, something so needed in this world. And this is when forgiveness will come, unforced, without strain, as a gift. In these high holidays, we're like the purple crocuses on the screen, ever hopeful, pushing through, ever growing, resolved to change, resolved to meet the world with compassion and love, and yes, even forgiveness. As the poem on the back of today's orders of service reminds us, trust more the tensile strands of love that bend and stretch to hold you in the web of life that's often torn, but always healing. There is your strength, the shifting plates, the rest of earth, your room, your precious life. They all proceed from love, the ground on which we walk together. And today we're ending our sermon a little bit differently. We're going to end with a responsive song. So I will speak a line, and the congregation will respond each time with the line, "We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love." Let's say that 2 times just to practice. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For remaining silent when a single voice would have made a difference. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time that our fears have made us rigid and inaccessible. Forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time we have struck out in anger, each time that greed has blinded us to the needs of others. We forgive ourselves and each other. For the selfishness that sets us apart and alone. Falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For losing sight of our unity. For those and for so many acts, both evident and subtle, which have fueled the illusion of separateness. We believe ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. Amen. Blessed be, and namaste.